Okay, so thank you very much. And let's start now the IC 2016 28th meeting with this opening plenary session, traditional risk factors in environmental health. It's really a great honor for me to invite our first speaker, who is Professor ALBERTO BERTAZZI from the Milan State University Medical School. He has been and still is an important point of reference in the European and international community of environmental epidemiology. The main focus of Professor BERTAZZI's lifelong research activity has been the employment of epidemiological methods for the study, recognition, and management of work-related disease determinants. His studies on the population exposed to the Seveso industrial disaster are largely acknowledged among the seminal works on the health effect of dioxin on humans. His molecular epidemiology lab pioneered the use of new tools for the study of molecular mechanism of exogenous risk factors. Environmental epigenetics is the latest development of his work, with studies focused on benzene, air pollution, and metals. ALBERTO is going to talk about the legacy of the accident at Seveso, which occurred 40 years ago in our country, and opened in Italy the season of the environmental and ecological studies on industrial accidents. So, please, ALBERTO.
Thank you very much, Carla, for the introduction, too kind. And thanks especially to the Society for inviting me to address the theme of the Seveso accident and its legacy 40 years after. Thank you. This is the theme of my talk. Seveso was by no means the deadliest chemical disaster ever. In spite of that, Seveso represented, I dare to say worldwide, a turning point, causing a major shift in the way we as individuals and as societies think about the relationships between our environment, our health, and our being a society or a community. And in addition, it made very clear that certain models of social and industrial development have or might have a disruptive impact on people's lives and their common home. This is why I use the word community. This is the plant where the accident occurred. It was an old plant in the northern border of the city of the town of Seveso, which is some 20 miles north of Milano, and with some 20,000 people living in it. And among the many production streams in this plant, one was for the manufacture of 2,4,5-trichlorophenol. And the market demand was very high, and trichlorophenol was very useful as an intermediate for the production of herbicide and disinfectants. And the demand was very high, so it was decided to add an additional production cycle during the week. But on Saturday, July 10th, 1976, the additional production cycle was stopped to be resumed on Monday, but something went wrong. And a runaway reaction took place in the batch reactor for the manufacture of TCP. There was a surge in temperature and pressure that caused a safety device to blow out and the content of the vessel to be vented directly into the atmosphere. The path of the toxic cloud was immediately visible on vegetation and crops. In addition, in the following hours, there were many reports of small wild and courtyard animal deaths, but especially there were almost immediately early signs of toxicity for the children who were playing outdoors. We were in July, and after a while, there were cases of chloracne, a rare skin disease that was known just in the occupational settings after exposure to polychlorinated aromatic hydrocarbons, so something really unusual in kids. On the 10th day after the accident, it was made known officially that TCDD was contained in the toxic cloud, which at that time was acknowledged and known as a potent animal toxicant, but with very limited data in humans. At that point, the area was fenced off. People have to leave their houses in the most contaminated areas. Their belongings has to be disposed or were disposed of, and their buildings, houses, shops were literally dismantled. In addition, cattle in the whole area and courtyard animals and poultry, nearly 80,000 heads, were slaughtered and buried. You know that that's one of the major ways into our diet through animals' products, meat, milk, etc. There were also lots of blood tests performed. Unfortunately, somebody had the brilliant idea to frozen some aliquots of those samples and store them for later use. Then the reclamation work started, and just to give you an example of these impressive works, the entire topsoil layer of the most contaminated area, some 43 hectares, was removed and was replaced with fresh, uncontaminated soil. That same area also hosted a couple of huge basins in which all the equipment used in those works and all the contaminated materials was safely buried and contained. The area was later turned into a park. This is how the park looks today. But not just a recreational area, but also a memorial not just through the breach of memory, which is not just a memory of the accident, but a memory for the environmental issue at large. So this was probably sufficient to let you realize why Seveso was such an important turning point. But how about today? In my view, the Seveso legacy is highly relevant to us as a scientific community and as a society as a whole for at least 4 reasons, which are listed here: policy, science, research, and community. And I'll try to shortly deal with each of them. Policy. I will give you 2 examples, one from the European Union legislation and one from the US. In 1982, the EU adopted a directive that was called the Seveso Directive for the prevention, control of major accident hazard of certain industrial activities. It was then amended in 1996 and was focused on the prevention, preparedness, and response to major accidents. In 2012, there was the Seveso Third Directive, which adopted a number of changes also to take care of the new classification of chemicals in Europe, and especially on the increased rights for citizens to access information and justice. The US example is this exercise from EPA to identify and estimate a sort of benchmark dose for systemic toxicants. This is the example for dioxin. And as you can probably see, there were plenty of animal bioassays available to make this estimate. But very few studies in humans, actually 3, and they all were coming from Seveso, which brings us to the second point of this legacy, which I consider extremely important today. That is that we have gained a deeper insight into the short and long-term effects of TCDD in humans. In fact, Seveso was unplanned from the scientific point of view and unique experimental setting because it was a sort of exposure to quotes, however, pure TCDD of a large population with both genders and all ages, different from what was known mainly in occupational cohorts. And there were a number of studies performed within this area. There were 3 major areas that were identified as exposed, as polluted on the basis of soil TCDD measurement. The A zone was the one with the highest pollution and some 700 people in it. The B zone with nearly 5,000 people living there at the time of the accident. And the R zone where the assessment of the exposures was less systematic, but was a very large zone, and R stay from respect. There were no precise data, the exposure was lower, but you have to be very careful with that zone too. And in addition, for our epidemiological studies, we use as a reference population the population living in 11 towns surrounding the 3 exposed area, towns with very similar characteristics in terms of social status, culture, diet, occupation, etc., etc. And there were a number of investigations concerning the function of liver, blood, kidney, immune system, the peripheral nervous system, chromosomal aberration, spontaneous abortion, perinatal mortality, low birth weight, and congenital malformation. None of those investigations provided explicit and evident signs of effects of TCDD, and there were no major departures from expected figures. But you have also to keep in mind that a post-disaster setting is not the ideal place where to conduct valid research. So many of those findings were eventually classified as inconclusive, with 2 major exceptions. One was chloracne, as already said. And I give you some idea of the frequency of chloracne in the different exposure zone. In the most polluted A zone, the number of children 3 to 14 years with chloracne was around 20%. And in the most polluted part of that area, the number of children with chloracne was nearer to 50%, 48.1. The second exception was an unexpected finding regarding offspring sex ratio. The expected sex ratio in our, say, in the Western country, generally, is 1.06. In a number of families with very, very high exposure to TCDD in the period 77-84, the sex ratio at birth was as low as 0.91, a change highly significant. And interestingly, this change was mainly linked to the value of the father TCDD serum in blood, TCDD in blood. So this was also an indication that the male reproductive system could be very sensitive to dioxin action. Then there were long-term studies regarding a number of outcomes: mortality, cancer incidence, women's health, and reproduction and second-generation studies. Regarding mortality and cancer incidence, I will give just the highlights. There are posters with more detail in them. The overall mortality was not changed compared to the expectation in any of the exposure zone. Incidence of cancer, all cancer, there were no major changes, but that suggestion of an increase in A zone among females. And if we take a closer look to the types and different types and sites of cancer in this population, we have these results, which is a clear increase, a neat increase in A zone and B zone of lymphatic and hematopoietic cancer in the 30-year period after the incident, most notably among females. And the increase was almost 2 among females in zone A and was 1.5 among females, again, in B zone. There was in the area another important long-term study, the Seveso Women's Health Study, which enrolled 1,000 women with a very special feature, to have not just to know the zone where they're coming from, but to have the serum concentration of dioxin. And the median concentration of this group of females, or women, was 55.8, and the project was mainly concerned with reproductive health and cancer risk. And as far as cancer risks, there were 2 relevant results. The first one is a hazard ratio of 1.8 for a 10-fold increase in serum TCDD for all cancers combined, which is relevant because it's relevant to the evaluation that IARC made, which was mainly based on all cancer occurrence. And there was also a suggestion of an increase for breast cancer. However, for breast cancer, we failed to find any increase in our study, but in A zone, but only in the 10 to 19 years latency period. In addition, instead, we had a suggestive increase of rectal cancer in both genders in B zone, without, however, a clear pattern by time since first exposure. These 2 findings were important for public health reasons, since we advised the family physicians in the area to tell people to participate in the screening program freely offered by the National Health Institute for this kind of cancer, which are very well validated and so useful to the people. There was also some suggestion for diabetes mellitus, but the results were not consistent. We found an increase somehow related to the exposure gradient, very clearly with the numbers, but it was mainly among women. In the Seveso Women Health Study, there was no increase of diabetes, and recently, and there is a poster on that, the health authority of the area performed a study that showed a higher prevalence in B zone of diabetes diagnosis, a very careful diagnosis of diabetes, contrary to what you can do with the death certificate. The diagnosis there was very careful. And they, however, found an increase only among men in B zone, mainly better among men in B zone. I'm pushing the button, sorry. Okay, sorry. Let's keep to the third, and will be very short, legacy from Seveso. And this concerns research. In which sense? Which are the health determinants that you have to consider when you perform a health impact assessment in a post-disaster setting? I've listed here 4, which is, to me, a very clear lesson from Seveso. Of course, the exposure, But then it's extremely important to take into account the post-disaster stress. A third characteristic is the peculiarities of those individuals and on their community, from the point of view of culture, work, occupation, social characteristics, etc. And finally, which is important to keep in mind, sometimes the response measure meant to mitigate the disaster effects might become disease determinants. An example, a quick one. Mortality in the whole period in Seveso, all-cause mortality, no increase. If we look at the first decade in Zone A, however, we have a suggestion of an increase. Let's take a closer look to that result. Wow, half of those deaths are due to cardiovascular disease causes, and the risk there becomes 1.6. If we only consider men in that estimate, the relative risk goes up to 2.01. Not only in the first decade, actually, the cardiovascular mortality was increased in the whole period, almost 40 years, 76, 2013, in men in A zone, the most polluted, for chronic ischemic and other heart disease, a twofold increase, and among women, to causes of death linked to hypertension and threefold increase, which are, how can we interpret these results? Let's go back to the other four possible determinants we mentioned before. Exposure, of course, TCDD is a very well-known cardiovascular toxic agent, but also the post-disaster stress was tremendous. The loss of your home, of your work, the uncertainty about the future, what was going to happen to those children so badly injured. And all that stress was also exacerbated by social rejection and media assault, unfortunately. Then there was a social disruption and heavy cultural pressures. The community's social cohesion is well documented as a mitigating factor in stressful situations. But that cohesion was dismantled by displacing people. And in addition, there was a harsh controversy regarding abortion. And finally, response measures. Since relocations fragmented relations among people, within families, within the communities, and heavily impacted on lifestyles. And last but not least, communication, which should be in the forefront in response measures. In fact, communication is not just a matter of providing data. It's a matter of building a relation, which is extremely useful. It can help avoiding mistrust, which is so common, especially because scientific uncertainty cannot fully avoid it. And so people always think you are cheating them. Instead, science has a margin of uncertainty by nature. In addition, a good communication can mitigate stressful factors and can foster population resilience, their ability to cope with the emerging situation and to recover. And then, last 2 minutes, community. People are able to carry out an active role in the response phase. The people participation is fundamental. And let me just take this as an introduction to the end of my presentation. 2 years after the accident, Time magazine was talking about Seveso as a dead community. Actually, it was the Italy Hiroshima and was closed like by a Berlin Wall, something like that. In fact, things went differently. But how come that a town that should have disappeared has become paradoxically, a special place, you can yourself verify that if you come to Milano, to the Milano area, a special place for the bottom-up blossoming of schools, centers of social life, music and art, as well as a place important for the memory of the environmental problem. Part of the answer, I think, certainly lies with the fact that there was a very active and participating community. And those dramatic days for those people were also days in which they discovered their capacity to mutually support each other, sharing needs, and a time of common endeavors to respond to them. Definitely, the intervention and the support of the national and regional government were decisive, but it was the spontaneous bottom-up initiatives arising from the population that reinforced special bonds and generated hope for all for the future. And this is the most, and has been the most important fuel for recovery. So let's probably remind, especially for certain countries, for certain cultures, and for the new generation, what Seveso, the Seveso legacy tells us. Regulation should guide our development. TCDD has clear effect, short and long term, especially in terms of risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease. There were endocrine and metabolic outcomes associated in many investigations. And there are very important second-generation studies that are examining adverse pregnancy outcomes and fertility. And then the fact that psychological conditions following the event are crucial in assessing the health impact of the event. We don't have to forget the mind is one of the gateways through which the environment acts on people's health. And finally, do not disempower people, also in the case of an accident. And informed community helps in response and can drive the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pier Alberto, for this excellent lecture magistralis and excellent talk. I think we all have to collect the legacy of such a disaster. And despite the time, I think we'll have time for a couple of comments from the floor. So please, if you have a question or a comment to Pier Alberto Bertazzi, go to the microphone. We have two here, and I think one or two up. So maybe some more light. Thank you so much.
I am Xin from Health Canada, and thank you very much for the 40 years ago. It's a sad story, but I am happy there is a follow-up study after, that accident and ongoing second-generation research. I was interested in your John A, B, and R and the reference area, but I found John A and B had a relatively small sample size. That's why your confidence interval is quite wider. So I think comparing John A, B, R, rather than different sample size, if you have data prior to the accident, then we can compare before and after the accident. That could be more reliable, outcomes to measure the impact of that accident. So, do you have any data prior to the accident?
Thank you. Good points. Yes, we do. We have made comparison in the same area before and after the accident, and there were no bias involved in the estimates we made. But that was a very important, research to be done. I agree with you. As to the sample size of A and B zone, you're right. if we pull together the two zones, as we have done in some communication, just to give an idea how things go in the larger, most polluted area, of course the increase is much, much more evident. But in any case, we are pretty confident in saying that in both zones there has been an increase for that type of cancer.
Any other comment? No? Can you see someone? No? No? Okay.
Thank you for your comments. I was interested in your comments and observations about the community as well as the psychosocial impacts on the community. And I also know you do occupational. In Europe, the job demand control model, effort reward model, and others have been used to try to do more systematic studies about psychosocial factors in the occupational setting. Have there been equivalent developments in the environmental setting about more formally and systematically studying the psychosocial impacts not only of major disasters like this, but the ongoing, what I call chronic impacts of social disparities and economic disparities in the community?
In my understanding, there are no similar development, at least in Italy. But I'm sure that it's extremely important. There are a few studies that are being doing on the population also exposed to air pollution and to noise, especially to noise is relevant, the psychosocial effect, much more than the hearing effect. So the point is that there are not so many studies going on, but something is starting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Paolo. So now we move to the second topic of this session. Again,